Thank you very much for that very extensive introduction. You've reminded me of my whole CV, parts of which I would rather forget, to be honest. I am nursing a cold, so if you can't hear me at the back, now is your chance to come forward. I'll do my best to project, but if you want to come forward and hear me better, please do. Let me begin by saying thank you to Olena one more time. Thank you to Sandra. Thank you to Professor Urbanski. Thank you to VIP. I like to call it VIP. Grant. And thank you to all of you for being here, for coming here tonight to talk about Ukraine. It's vital that we keep Ukraine at the heart of our attention discussions for as long as we need to. And it only took us 6 years for me to come here, so thanks. I'm really glad to be here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give you some observations of the last 3 years in particular related to epistemic mistrust and the production of knowledge, and what knowledge is seen as credible and what isn't. And then I'll try and think about how we can not just produce credible knowledge, but actually encourage people to become active witnesses when it comes to political violence. So a journey from passive spectator to engaged witness. And partly it's going to be based on the published work that I've published over the recent years, and some of this talk is based on brand new material that is still taking shape. So I'll be really curious to have the discussion with you afterwards. Okay. Why is such a pretty young thing researching a tough topic? An older male academic asked me at one of my first conferences I attended as a much younger researcher. My doctorate was in the history of the Second World War, and my specialty lay in military collaboration in the occupied territories. My expertise was probed because in his eyes, I was defying the norm. Come on. A pretty young thing does not produce knowledge. She produces entertainment, emotion, not expertise. That was the first time I discovered that I lacked credibility in other people's eyes, not because of what I knew, but because of who I was. Female, young, East European. The question of credibility goes far beyond the personal. Groups and nations are mistrusted if they do not fit into the accepted image of an authoritative source. Vladimir Putin denies the existence of Ukraine as a nation. Why is he wrong? I have heard this question from Western journalists repeated to me over the past 3 years, forcing me to justify the existence of a sovereign state. When your credibility is questioned, it's not enough to simply exist. You need to prove that you have the right to exist. Witnessing my country of birth being distrusted, even with its knowledge of itself, has led me to reflect on the credibility not only of individuals, but also of nations. In the 4th year of Russia's full-scale war, it's easy to forget that Ukraine was predicted to fall within days after Russia began its all-out invasion in February 2022. Russia was perceived as superior militarily, economically, and politically. Ukraine was presented as corrupt, divided, and weak. This had serious consequences. The overestimation of the aggressor and the underestimation of Ukraine's ability to stand up for itself had a direct impact on the sort of help that was made available to Kyiv and the speed at which it was delivered. It had a direct impact on the scale of casualties. More than 3 years into Ukraine's full-scale resistance, this is a term coined by Sasha Dobzhik, I've yet to hear anything resembling an apology or even an admission of misjudgment from those who confidently predicted the swift fall of Kyiv. The problem of credibility clearly persists, and recent geopolitical developments have shown just how fragile declarations like "nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine" can be. It doesn't take much for us to slip back into a world where the voices of so-called great men dominate, speaking over the people whose lives are at stake. we wanted to see if they'd actually fight before giving them weapons, said one of the professors at a talk I gave in Germany, as it happens, soon after the start of the full-scale invasion. The implication of that comment was that they, the Ukrainians, needed to prove themselves worthy of trust to us, the West. The first 8 years of Russia's war in Ukraine, which went largely unnoticed outside of Eastern Europe, the 3 decades of striving for democratic reforms as an independent state, and a few centuries of anti-imperialist struggle were not proof enough. Ukrainians' historical fight for the right to sovereignty might have been accepted as sufficient evidence that they would put up resistance in the new colonial war had it been recognized. Yet traditionally, Ukraine's own narratives of its past have been dismissed in favor of the distorted versions presented by a neighboring dictator who denied the country's existence. It was that version that was then mansplained or West-splained back to us by talking heads in the West, in the media, who, despite possessing little relevant expertise, were recognized as authoritative. Being a feminist and working on questions of gender and war has equipped me with tools that came in handy when observing the international community's perception of Russia's war in Ukraine. In the hierarchy of voices recognized as credible, women's voices continue to be barely audible. Their exact position depends on the social and ethnic backgrounds, but it's always below that of influential white male voices. Similarly, nations that don't correspond to the patriarchal Western ideal are dismissed as minor and insignificant, even if by size they might be the largest in the region. Size only matters if it's matched by economic wealth and political power. The need for Ukrainians to prove themselves worthy of help in Russia's genocidal war reminded me of an interview with a servicewoman I once conducted for my research. When I asked her if she had experienced any gender discrimination in the army, she said, "At first, the soldiers treat you as a woman, but then you prove to them that you're a soldier, and then they treat you equally after that." A woman must prove that she's a politician, a scientist, a writer, a historian, a soldier, before she is treated equal to a man. In other words, to be taken seriously, her skills and knowledge must be shaped into the recognizable norm that was created for and by men. Those who defy the norm lack credibility. Ukraine, a country with just over 3 decades of independence, has been perceived as a pretty young thing. Ukrainian voices, who were included in the reporting of Russia's war in the media, were expected to be emotional, tearful, distressed, but not authoritative. They were then often followed by a commentary of a non-Ukrainian expert whose job was to give an objective assessment of the situation. Being emotional and credible at the same time didn't seem to be feasible to editors, although Ukrainian experts whose loved ones were in danger and whose homes were being bombed were still providing crucial expertise while doing so emotionally. It is little wonder that the defiance, unity, and clear sense of historical and civic identity Ukrainians showed in the months following the full-scale invasion left the world surprised. These qualities did not fit into the pre-existing image of Ukraine. Like many nations, Ukraine has frequently been imagined in literature and art as a woman. The 19th century romantics depicted it either as a victim who had been taken advantage of by an imperialist lord, or as an exotic beauty to be conquered and tamed. In 20th century wartime depictions, it was presented as a mother or a deity that gathers her children around her to keep them away from harm. More recently, Ukraine has been presented as a warrior princess, sometimes equipped with modern weapons and sometimes with supernatural powers. These collective images are fantasies, mostly conjured up by men. Whether she's pitied, admired, venerated, or feared, this woman nation does not command authority. A nation that doesn't boast centuries of uninterrupted statehood lacks legitimacy until it is shaped into a form that fits the recognized norm. Ukrainians, of course, were not the only ones perceived as lacking credibility in all of this. Other East European countries who warned of Russia's brutality and called for a tougher stance before the full-scale invasion were dismissed as hawkish. The way they viewed their historical colonial relationship with the Kremlin was seen as emotional and thus less valid. The objective assessment offered by those states, for instance Germany, that had established more amiable trading relations with the leaders of the Russian Federation, enjoyed more credibility. If the experiential knowledge of East Central European countries had been heeded sooner, it could have better prepared us for the ruthlessness that is habitually used by Moscow as a means of waging wars. For instance, I know the room is full of historians, so you'll recognize some of these references. Those who know about the Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine of the 1930s, which killed millions of Ukrainian peasants, were not surprised to see the Kremlin manufacture a grain crisis that could have led to major famine. Those who were familiar with the massacre of Polish officers in 1940 by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, were not shocked by the killing of Ukrainian prisoners of war in Olenivka by the Russians in July 2022. Those familiar with the atrocities committed by the Red Army during the Second World War were appalled, but not surprised, by the mass rapes carried out by Russian soldiers in the occupied territories all over Ukraine in the last 3 years. Those who have grieved their loved ones in the mass graves of Stalinist terror were not surprised by the sight of mass graves of Irpin, Bucha, Mariupol, Izium, etc. Unlike in London, Washington, Paris, or Berlin, those in East Central Europe do not think Ukrainians are insensitive for expressing rage or anger or even hatred towards the nation that has claimed to be a brotherly people but has in fact chosen to become an enemy. They know that it's insensitive not to feel outraged on behalf of those who are being targeted by this unprovoked aggression. Those with experiential knowledge of Russian imperialism know how important it is to be as precise as possible in our language. Not a crisis, not the Ukraine war, but Russia's war against Ukraine. Language matters. Language is being used as a weapon of war by the Kremlin. They also know that using the shield of neutrality in the name of responsible reporting, or indeed unbiased scholarship, is in fact irresponsible. Because there's nothing responsible or unbiased in treating two sides of the story with equal validity when it is clear that the only source for one of them is Kremlin propaganda. Such reporting or scholarship is naive at best and outright harmful at worst. Those experienced in dealing with the Kremlin's colonial ambitions know that appeasing Moscow comes at a cost. The cost is paid by those who are frequently perceived as lacking credibility on the international arena. Ukraine should surrender the territories occupied by Russia, a Western academic tells me. It is your route to peace. Surrendering temporarily occupied territories means leaving our citizens under occupation, which comes with deprivation of all rights, if you're lucky, and summary execution if you're not. I try to explain. It's an invitation to further escalation and the spread of occupation, not to peace. I continue, but I'm not sure my words are being heard. You say your country needs more weapons from the West to help you win the war, but let me tell you what you really need. You need to lower your conscription age to 18. No weapons will resolve your manpower problem. I listened to yet another wise old man, a British politician in this case, tell me that I'm wrong, that my country is wrong, that in its needs, choices, and experiences. I ask him if he truly believes that throwing more untrained people into the grinder of war is a better solution than securing more military aid. He struggles to respond with clarity and says, we simply mustn't escalate this conflict any further. We can't let it spill into the rest of Europe. A little innocent blood, for the salvation of humanity. The humanity that deserves to be saved, however, does not consist of bodies on the battlefield. It consists of the sons and daughters of the nations that matter. Nations with wealth, power, and a long tradition of statehood. People born and raised in countries that are seen as little more than a buffer zone can be easily sacrificed to save humanity. The buffer zone itself can be sacrificed. Its land can be poisoned by landmines, its air can be polluted by toxic substances, and its water can be contaminated by unexploded ordnances. Credibility is a basic survival tool, writes Rebecca Solnit. In her 2008 essay, Men Explain Things to Me, she describes how women, regardless of the knowledge that they possess, lack credibility simply because they are not men. At the heart of Solnit's reflection is an anecdote from her own life, when a man attempted to explain a very important book to her before realizing that Solnit had written that book. Yet 12 years later, Solnit revised her definition of credibility. In Recollections of My Non-Existence, she wrote the following: I was wrong that it's a tool. You hold the tool in your own hands, and you use it yourself. What it does is up to you. Your credibility arises in part from your society, or from how your society perceives people like you. End of quote. Assuming that some people are not reliable witnesses to their own lives, to quote Solnit, because they don't fit our idea of credibility, sooner or later will come to haunt us. When we distrust nations such as Ukraine and keep on West-splaining their experience to them, we endorse the world where might is always right. We continue to appease aggressors, but sooner or later, it will be our freedom that will come under threat. To break the cycle of distrust, we must stop equating lasting statehood, which frequently comes with a baggage of imperialism, with authority. We must realize that a claim to superiority does not automatically translate into expertise. We must perceive those for whom this war presents an existential threat as a credible source of knowledge, not only for the sake of their survival, but also for the survival of the democratic order as we know it. When entire peoples are denied credibility, when their voices are dismissed, their history is questioned, and their suffering rendered negotiable, the consequences are not just for those who are distrusted, but also for those who distrust. Feminist approach helps us understand that credibility is political. Russia's war in Ukraine has demonstrated that it is also existential. The refusal to take Ukraine seriously is not simply an epistemic failure. It is evidence of political short-sightedness. And I would now like to turn to this gap between transmitting knowledge and being believed, between witnessing and acting, and help us move from advocating for credibility to allowing the experiences of those who have lived through war to transform those who have not. I am war. We Ukrainians all became a war. Nothing else about us matters now. These words belong to Victoria Amelina and appear in her Looking at Women, Looking at War, a book that was published in February 2025, posthumously, because Victoria was killed in June 2023, in the middle of writing it. Amelina was a writer, but with the start of the full-scale invasion, or the big war, as we call it in Ukraine, she became a war crimes investigator. She became war. Her words that were once love, history, city, family, secrets, became war too. She was killed in a Russian missile strike on a restaurant while dining with fellow writers, a war crime similar to those she had dedicated herself to recording in the book that she was writing. Much like a body shattered in a war zone, her manuscript had to be assembled from half-finished chapters and mere notes to self by a group of Amelina's friends and colleagues. War is a collective endeavor. Being war is too. While this big war began over 3 years ago with Russia's mass bombardment of Ukrainian cities, many who, like Amelina, knew Eastern Ukraine intimately, had been living through the small war, had been living as war since 2014, long before the big one erupted. There are young people in Ukraine who have known no normality other than the twisted one of war. To them, the sound of home is the wailing of an air raid siren, the shattering of a window, the thump of an explosion, and the hushed voice of a parent urging them to sleep in the bathtub or a basement until yet another nocturnal strike fades away. There are also those who were children when the small war crept into their lives, only to come of age in time for the big one to rip their lives apart. Some of them volunteered, and others were drafted to take up arms in defense of their homeland. They, too, are war now. A 2024 study exploring the effects of Russia's war on the daily lives and mental health of people living in Ukraine found that almost 88% have experienced a lifetime bereavement, with a significant number suffering from prolonged grief disorder as a result of losing a loved one in the war. It is a society where everyone carries the pain of war, some in the form of visible wounds and others through scars unseen. Albeit invisible to the naked eye, grief finds a way to manifest itself. It becomes particularly tangible to the naked eye, but it becomes particularly tangible in graveyards, taking the shape of a body draped in black, gently rocking like a child trying to self-soothe. And when the living step away from the dead, and an invisible thread woven from phantom pain binds them to the people and places lost. A kind of Ariadne thread, one that we hope will guide us back once the Minotaur has been slain. In a survey conducted in 2023, almost 80% of Ukrainians reported that a close relative or a friend had been injured or killed due to Russian invasion. You'll struggle to find a Ukrainian household inside or outside of the country unaffected by war. In fact, you don't need to travel to Ukraine to see war. The next time you hear Ukrainian or a Ukrainian version of Russian spoken on the train, at the school gates, in a university classroom, or in your local pub, chances are you are hearing war. War bears strange beasts. In her book, Amelina describes returning to Ukraine hours after the start of the full-scale invasion, while a large number of Ukrainians, mostly women with dependents, were escaping the onslaught. Standing on the Polish border, she observed the queue of displaced Ukrainians. I'm quoting, "The crowd looks like a giant moaning creature with hundreds of hands, mouths, and eyes. The giant must be in pain. I want to turn away, but I make myself look. I have to stop seeing the suffering creature and start seeing individual human beings. They are primarily women and children, like my son and me," writes Amelina. But even if she stops seeing the crowd and starts seeing the individuals, she can't stop seeing their pain. Because the moaning giant is made of phantom pain. And when the queue disperses around cities and villages in countries so far unaffected by war, the pain disperses with it, inhabiting places where it is least expected. The skill is in reading it, because pain too is a record of war. Writing about physical pain, Elaine Scarry in her The Body in Pain says that, I'm quoting, "Whatever pain achieves, it achieves in part through its unshareability, and it ensures this unshareability through its resistance to language." She goes on to say that pain does not simply resist language, but actively destroys it. If the pain caused by the violence of war is also unrepresentable, never fully, not entirely, then it too risks becoming unshareable. And if the pain is unshareable through the language available to us, what can we use to build a bridge between those who are war and those who are not war yet? In her Regarding the Pain of Others, Susan Sontag says that flooded with war images that once used to shock and arouse indignation, we are losing our capacity to react. She continues, but what is really being asked of here? That images of carnage be cut back to, say, once a week? No committee of guardians is going to ration horror to keep fresh its ability to shock. And the horrors themselves are not going to abate. End of quote. Perhaps it's not the images or words themselves that incapacitate us, but rather our fear that by looking at war, we might become war. Perhaps that is the real obstacle to learning the sort of language that would allow the pain to be representable and thus shareable. And perhaps that is what prevents us from the act of true witnessing. A novelist who turned herself into a war witness, Amelina compared building a case that would stand in the court of law to writing a novel. In her last book, she says that in order to do it right, you have to know everything, every detail. If you don't see it, how it all happened, the reader won't either. Convincing international judges must not be easier, end of quote. She goes on to explain that knowledge drawn from lived experience forms the core of the case. War crimes research involves collecting and analyzing a wide range of evidence, but the key element is always witness testimonies, says Amelina. While testimonies of lived experience are vital in helping us shape the language that brings us closer to the sharing of pain, they carry an inherent flaw. They exist because they are conveyed by a survivor. The incompleteness of the survivor's testimony is famously discussed by Primo Levi. A chemist who became a writer, in order to bear witness, Levi understood the pitfalls of the testimony like no other. In his The Drowned and the Saved, he says that we, the survivors, are not true witnesses. We survivors are those who, by their prevarications or abilities or good luck, did not touch the bottom. Those who did so are the complete witnesses, the ones whose deposition would have a general significance. Another writer preoccupied with keeping a record of Russia's war and who, like Amelina, was killed in a war crime is Volodymyr Vakulenko. He is one of those who touched the bottom. He kept a record of the occupation of his native town before he was murdered by the occupiers. Amelina discovered his diary buried in the ground before the author, buried in the ground by the author before his tortured body was discovered in a mass grave. A document that brings us closer to the horror of the invasion. His testimony, however, is also incomplete. While survivors can't tell the whole story because they go on living, the rupture caused by murder renders the victim's testimony unfinished. In his Remnants of Auschwitz, Giorgio Agamben explores the incompleteness of witnessing and writes that every testimony contains a lacuna. He describes testimony as the disjunction between two impossibilities of bearing witness, and argues that language, in order to bear witness, must give way to a non-language in order to show the impossibility of bearing witness. And so, if pain resists and destroys language, then it only makes sense that war literature should be written in non-language, the sort that would allow it to transmit the testimony and pain of war beyond those who are already war. Amelina's book opens with highly polished chapters, rich in historical context and bejeweled by gallows humor. It begins to disintegrate halfway through, to decompose. What was skillfully crafted, much like a symphony composed to move, to disturb, to lift, fractures into a collection of sound, disjointed, struggling for coherence, yet still managing to communicate. The book comes to resemble a house struck by a missile, one part standing, seemingly untouched by war, the other collapsed, uninhabitable, treacherous. To grasp its story, and that of those who lived within it, one must step through the rubble, lift the debris, read its history in fragments. To witness the collapse is a way of remembering the whole. Looking at Women, Looking at War is thus written partly in the refined, sharp prose one would expect from a high-caliber work of nonfiction, and partly in a language seldom found on the shelves of major bookstores and libraries. But a language destroyed by the pain of war must not be a language silenced. A book that is part text and part rubble can speak more clearly of war. In fact, it might be the truest representation of war, the only possible, perhaps. Of course, the reader might choose to ignore the passages that are written in the non-language of war. But it's a choice that comes with responsibility in acknowledging that violence becomes unspeakable when its testimony is inaudible. Amelina will not write another novel. She will not compose another poem. But her unfinished book, with its numerous empty pages, is a crucial contribution not only to building a case for the future courts of justice, but also to war literature. In its structural disintegration, her text can reside in the lacuna that Agamben speaks about. In its decomposition, her language resists the destruction that Scary speaks of. It uses empty pages not as the absence of words, but as non-language that gives the pain it describes a possibility of being shared. It is up to the reader to embrace this possibility, to witness responsibly. Agamben makes a distinction between the different types of witnessing. In Latin, there are two words for witness. The first word, testis, from which our word testimony derives, etymologically signifies a person who, in a trial or a lawsuit between two rival parties, is in the position of a third party, he explains. It is this type of witnessing that much of the international community seems to adopt in relation to Ukraine. While observing the genocidal violence, it remains untouched by it. The second word, supestis, designates a person who has lived through something, who has experienced an event from beginning to end, and can therefore bear witness to it, says Agamben. Supesto means to remain standing, and this type would apply to those in Ukraine who are war. In addition to these types of witnessing, there's also one proposed by the Greek word, martys, derived from the verb that means to remember. Traditionally, it tends to be applied to someone who witnesses their own persecution or death for refusing to renounce a belief or a cause. As such, this type of witnessing tends to be applied posthumously. Amelina drew parallels between the generation of Ukrainian creatives who were obliterated by the Soviet regime and that of creatives today, destroyed by the Russian forces. Having found Vakulenko's diary, she deposited it to the Kharkiv Literature Museum, the place that houses the salvaged body of literature by creatives whose physical bodies were destroyed in a number of waves of imperial violence. Describing the museum's collection, Amelina says, I'm quoting, "The archive would mean nothing to the rest of the world. They are the weird ones, Ukrainians by choice. They are the executed Renaissance, slaughtered, buried in mass graves in the 1930s, and prohibited from being remembered in the Soviet Union. They are the Ukrainian 60ers, sent to the camps in the 1960s and 70s for daring to remember. Their works were not translated in time to become part of world literature and European discourse." End of quote. Amelina made sure that Vakulenko's name meant something to the world. She hurried to write her own book in English, so it wouldn't be added to the pile of untranslated and thus so often unreadable and unshareable works of Ukrainian literature. She kept the memory of the fates of several waves of her predecessors and bore witness to the loss of contemporaries who have been posthumously and perhaps problematically named martyrs before she joined their ranks. It is not martyrdom that Amelina sought. Like Levy, who became a writer, she became a war crimes investigator to bear witness. Her witnessing had one expressive aim: justice. A book that disintegrates in our hands can be treated as Amelina's invitation to join her in the pursuit of justice by becoming a witness to this war through her writing, as well as through the empty pages. This act of witnessing, if truly embraced, will change us to the point that we too will become war. To witness the pain of this genocidal war is to stop pretending that the world hasn't changed, because our part of the building still stands, even though the rest of it lies in ruin. It is to step into the rubble, to inhale the dust, to listen closely to the fractured non-language of war and make it our own. To let it inhabit us, reshape us, fracture us. To witness war is to embody its pain, to admit that now we are war. And I'm going to end my talk by reading Victoria's poem, first in translation by Owen Blacker, and then in original Ukrainian. I don't write poetry, I write prose, but the reality of war devours punctuation, plot structure, devoured, as though language has been shelled. The debris of language resembles poems, but it is not poetry, and neither is this. Poetry is in Kharkiv, volunteering. Я не пишу поезію, я прозаїк. Просто реальність війни з'їдає пунктуацію, зв'язність сюжету, зв'язність з'їдає, наче у мову влучив снаряд. Уламки мови схожі на поезію, але це не вона. І це теж не вона. Вона в Харкові волонтерить. Thank you.